All right, get ready to dive deep into some really interesting research on preventing something called ventilator-associated pneumonia.
Or VAP for short,
Right, VAP.
in patients with acute brain injuries.
And we're looking at a few sources for this one.
We've got a 2024 Lancet Respiratory Medicine article,
Oh yeah, that one was dense.
some journal club notes that really break things down,
Always helpful.
and a critical appraisal that, well, it really digs into the details.
So basically, we're giving you the shortcut to being totally informed.
Exactly.
So why is this such a big deal?
Well, VAP is a huge problem in the ICU.
I can imagine.
Especially for people with brain injuries, their risk is really high.
How high are we talking?
Think like 20 to even 71%.
Wow, that's a lot.
And part of that is because they often aspirate before intubation.
Makes sense.
Plus, their immune systems are often kind of weak.
Right, adding insult to injury.
Literally.
So how do doctors usually try to prevent VAP?
Typically, it's a combo of antibiotics
Well-
and these methods called selective digestive decontamination, or SDD,
That sounds intense.
and selective oropharyngeal decontamination,
Which is old.
SOD.
SOD. Gotcha.
But those are pretty intense.
That you said.
And they can lead to antibiotic resistance.
That's definitely not ideal.
So researchers in France wanted to see if there might be a simpler way.
Okay, what did they come up with?
They wondered if just a single dose of an antibiotic called ceftriaxone could work.
Ceftriaxone. All right, I've heard of that one.
They did this big trial called the PROPHY-VAP trial.
Catchy.
It was a multicenter, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial.
The gold standard, right.
Exactly.
So who was in this trial?
They enrolled 319 adults with different types of brain injuries,
Like what?
traumatic brain injuries, strokes, subarachnoid hemorrhage.
A pretty diverse group then.
Yeah, and they all needed to be on a ventilator for at least 2 days.
So what did they do with these patients?
Half of them got a single dose of the ceftriaxone.
And the other half?
They got a placebo.
Basically salt water.
Right.
And what were they looking for?
Specifically, they were looking at early VAP.
Meaning?
VAP that develops within the first 7 days.
Makes sense.
And get this, the ceftriaxone group had way lower rates of early VAP.
How much lower?
Only 14%.
Okay.
Compared to 32% in the placebo group.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Right.
So how do we make sense of those numbers?
Well, there's this thing called the number needed to treat, or NNT.
I've heard of that. What is it again?
It tells you how many people you need to give the treatment to
Okay.
in order to prevent one case of the problem.
Like the lower the better, right?
Yeah, the lower the NNT, the more impactful the treatment.
Gotcha.
And in this study, the NNT was 5
So only 5 people need to get the ceftriaxone.
to prevent one case of early VAP.
That's pretty impressive.
It really is.
So fewer people got sick, but were there other benefits?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
No.
They also looked at how long people were on ventilators,
Okay.
how much antibiotics they needed overall. Right.
And even how well they were doing on a disability scale,
Which scale?
the modified Rankin scale.
All right.
And guess what?
They did better
Way better.
across the board.
Pretty much, they spent less time on ventilators.
That's huge.
They needed fewer antibiotics.
Good news.
And they even had better scores on the disability scale.
So this single dose is a miracle cure.
Well, not so fast.
There's a catch.
There are always some things to keep in mind.
Like what?
This study didn't really look at how the ceftriaxone might have messed with gut bacteria.
Oh, right. That's important.
And it was all done in France.
So maybe the results wouldn't be the same everywhere else.
Exactly.
Okay, good points to consider.
It's promising, but we need more research.
For sure. So should doctors start using this single dose right now?
That's a great question, and that's what we're going to get into next.
Let's unpack that.
So we just talked about how a single dose of ceftriaxone could be a game changer for preventing early VAP in patients with brain injuries. And now we're going to talk about how this actually plays out in the real world.
Right, like how doctors would actually use this information.
Okay, so imagine you're a doctor in the ICU and you have a patient with a severe brain injury.
And they're at high risk for VAP.
It's a scary situation.
For sure.
And this study gives you a new tool, a potential solution.
And it's relatively simple, just one dose.
With an NNT of 5, that's pretty compelling.
Yeah, for every 5 patients who get the ceftriaxone.
You could potentially prevent one case of early VAP.
Exactly.
It's something concrete you can offer patients and their families.
It can give them some hope in a really difficult time.
And it shows how important it is to stay on top of the latest research.
This study could really change how we think about VAP prevention.
But of course, we need to be realistic.
Right, it's just one study.
Done in France.
So we can't just assume it applies everywhere.
Different places have different bacteria.
And different healthcare practices.
So we have to be careful about applying these findings too broadly. But still, it's a big step forward.
It gives us something new to consider.
And speaking of things to consider, the critical appraisal talked a lot about antimicrobial stewardship.
Even with just one dose, we have to be careful about antibiotic resistance.
It's a balancing act.
Right, we want to use effective treatments.
But we don't want to create superbugs.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot.
And the journal Club Notes made a good point about not forgetting the basics.
Things like good oral hygiene.
And careful suctioning techniques.
Those are still really important.
This new research is an addition to our toolbox.
Not a replacement for everything else we do.
Right, it's about building on what we already know.
Evolution, not revolution.
Okay, so let's talk about the economic side of things.
Because VAP is expensive.
It leads to longer hospital stays.
More use of resources.
And even long-term disability.
So could this single dose actually save money?
It's possible, right.
Preventing even a few cases of VAP could have a big impact.
The study found that patients who got Ceftriaxone needed fewer antibiotics overall.
And they spent less time on ventilators.
Those things add up quickly.
But we also have to factor in the cost of the ceftriaxone itself.
And the cost of monitoring for any side effects.
It's a complex equation.
But it's worth exploring.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about the money.
Right. Patient outcomes are what really matter.
And speaking of outcomes, the modified Rankin scale findings were really encouraging.
The ceftriaxone group had better functional outcomes.
Meaning they were less disabled after their brain injuries.
That's a huge win for patients and their families.
So this intervention could have a positive impact beyond just preventing VAP.
It could improve their overall quality of life.
Now, I'm curious about the practicalities of all this.
Like how easy it would be for hospitals to actually implement this.
Right, what challenges might they face?
Well, one challenge could be changing established protocols.
Hospitals often have set ways of doing things.
And adding a new intervention might require some adjustments.
It takes time to get everyone on board.
And another challenge could be ensuring consistent implementation.
You need everyone on the healthcare team to be on the same page.
Exactly. From the doctors to the nurses to the respiratory therapists.
Everyone needs to understand why we're doing this.
And how to do it correctly.
Education and training are key.
Absolutely.
And we can't forget about monitoring.
Right. We need to track how well this intervention is working in real-world settings.
See if there are any unexpected side effects.
And monitor for any signs of antibiotic resistance.
It's an ongoing process.
We need to constantly evaluate and refine our approach.
Now, one thing that really struck me in the journal Club Notes was the idea of empowering patients and families.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about it from their perspective.
They're dealing with a terrifying situation.
Their loved one has a severe brain injury.
And then they hear about the risk of VAP.
It's overwhelming.
Absolutely.
But imagine if the doctor could say,
we have this new strategy that can significantly reduce the risk.
it could give them a sense of hope and control.
When they feel like everything is spinning out of control.
Exactly. And it can foster a sense of partnership in the patient's care.
When patients and families understand what's happening,
They're more likely to be active participants in their own recovery.
it's a shift from a paternalistic model of care.
To a more collaborative and patient-centered approach.
Exactly.
So we've talked about the PROPHY-VAP trial
The potential benefits and challenges.
and the broader implications for brain injury care.
But before we move on,
I have a thought-provoking question.
I'm all ears.
This study focused on VAP prevention.
Right.
But could this intervention have even wider effects?
Like, what do you mean?
Could it impact brain injury recovery in general?
That's an interesting question.
We know that infections can slow down healing.
And worsen neurological outcomes.
So if we prevent infections,
Could we see better overall recovery?
it's like a ripple effect.
Preventing one problem leads to improvements in other areas.
It's a reminder that everything in healthcare is connected,
Our interventions can have unexpected consequences.
both positive and negative.
We have to be mindful of that.
So this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
From the specifics of the trial to the big picture implications.
And now we want to hear from you, the listener.
What are your takeaways?
What questions do you still have?
This is just the beginning of the conversation.
We encourage you to keep exploring this topic
Seek out more information.
and talk to your colleagues about it.
Because medical knowledge is always evolving.
Stay curious, stay informed.
And stay engaged in the pursuit of better healthcare for everyone.
Now, We're going to take a short break.
And when we come back,
We'll delve even deeper into the implications of this research.
and explore some really thought-provoking questions.
Stay tuned. Welcome back.
We've talked a lot about this Ceftriaxone trial.
Seen how it could change things?
Mm.
There are always more questions. What don't we know yet?
Well, one thing that needs more research is the long-term impact on gut bacteria.
Right. Even one dose of antibiotics can throw things off.
It's a delicate balance in there.
So could there be unexpected consequences down the line?
It's possible.
Could it affect how well patients recover overall?
We don't really know yet.
It could mess with their immune system.
Or how their body absorbs nutrients.
Maybe even their mental health.
We need to study these things carefully.
And antibiotic resistance is always a concern.
Absolutely, even though the study didn't show an increase.
We still need to be cautious.
If this single dose becomes common practice,
We have to track resistance patterns closely.
and make sure everyone understands the importance of using antibiotics responsibly.
Doctors, patients, everyone.
It's a shared responsibility.
So this study was about VAP prevention.
Right.
But I'm wondering if it could have a bigger impact.
Yeah.
Could it affect brain injury recovery in general?
That's an interesting thought.
Infections can really slow down healing.
And they can make neurological problems worse.
So if we can prevent infections,
It could help patients recover faster.
maybe even better in the long run?
It's like taking away an obstacle in their path.
Exactly.
It shows how everything is connected in healthcare.
What we do for one thing can affect everything else.
We have to keep that in mind.
Now, this study is just the beginning.
It opens up so many possibilities for future research.
We can explore different aspects of this intervention.
Like the timing of the dose.
Could we give it even earlier?
Or maybe multiple doses would be better.
And what about other patients?
Could this work for preventing infections in other critically ill people?
There's so much more to learn.
And we need to find new ways to monitor gut bacteria.
And develop strategies to protect it from the effects of antibiotics.
It's all about pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
To find better ways to care for our patients.
Well said.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
From the details of the trial to the bigger picture.
Now we want to hear from you, the listener.
What are you thinking?
What stood out to you?
What questions do you still have?
Keep exploring this topic
Talk to your colleagues.
and stay curious.
Because medical knowledge is always changing.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.